Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today, the roller coaster rise and fall of one of our favorite developers. We're talking Technosoft.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that, as we like to say, is fluent in gaming. We're excited to have you and that people continue to listen to us. Who would have thunk it? If you like what we're doing, then make sure to leave us a review on iTunes or leave us some feedback on Instagram or Twitter, where you can find us by the name of the podcast. That's at Region Free Gamers Podcast. The main thing that keeps us going is knowing that people like what we're doing and that we are reaching more and more ears. And the best way to do that really is through reviews and word of mouth. So we are counting on you all for that. So we heard that you all like when we talk about niche Japanese developers. So in that light, we decided to dig through history and talk about a developer that is not known to many, but to some that know them, they know that they were something special. Their heyday was in the Genesis Mega Drive days, and they were best known for shoot-'em-ups with kick-ass soundtracks. We are, of course, talking about Technosoft, a company that is now defunct, but which left behind a trove of great games. To discuss this obscure topic, we have enlisted some help. Returning for the third time is Polybits Anthony, who you last heard bumping lines on the Grand Theft Auto Vice City episode. Thankfully, he's now sober and in good shape.
Ready for my next bump.
What's up, man?
What's up, guys? How you doing? Good to be back. I think I got my green jacket now.
I think now you are the most frequented guest here.
Yes.
So,
Indeed.
So.
we're gonna give you a plaque and,
I can't wait.
And a prompt kick in the ass after this.
That sounds about right. It's in the contract, so...
Also with me today.
I don't care as long as he brings the Germans.
Yes, it's the only thing keeping us number one, man.
Right. So,
you're welcome. You know what? I mean, Rick keeps us, with the female demographic, and Anthony just keeps us in Germany. There's an inside story for that we'll get to at some point in the future. Also with me today is our designated old guy who actually remembers when all these games came out. Say hello to our hunky Canadian, Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul, and my wife loves Rick, and that's what the story is.
True story, actually. True.
Yeah, she downloaded
story.
the Xbox episode.
Oh.
She downloaded the Xbox episode and heard Rick, and she was like, "Whoo, it's hot in here. Who is this guy?"
Rick just has that sex voice, Barry White would be envious of Rick.
Oh,
Indeed. We need to have him back and not show my wife.
I was saying that we should actually put a disclaimer when Rick joins again. There may be fainting spells if some of our listeners hear his voice.
Lock down your wives. Put them away.
Yes.
Don't let them listen to this dude.
Listen, firefighters, have honed that perfect voice. So there you go.
Damn. Yep.
And of course, we have the man behind the curtain, the veritable Wizard of Oz of the podcast. If you have ever talked to us on Instagram or Twitter, then it was most likely him. Say hello to Action Man Arnie from Puerto Rico by way of New England.
I look forward to saying the word Zwei, possibly incorrectly many times today. Zwei, one of those.
Shrilly, if you're listening, please make sure to correct us after the episode and tell us how dumb we all sound.
I personally prefer Zoe as my pronunciation.
Oh my god. Even I won't say that.
We're gonna butcher this, aren't we? It's gonna be we're gonna lose our number one standing with all the Germans.
And this is for Germany. I mean, this is dedicated to Germany, this episode.
So
I think
now
the top two German events were David Hasselhoff singing on top of the Berlin Wall and this podcast episode.
Now that we have gone completely off the rails, let's get back into it. So, Paul, I want to start with you. When did you first hear of Technosoft?
I played their games sporadically when I was a little kid, right? But it didn't really occur to me that Technosoft was Technosoft, so to speak, until I got a little bit older and I actually started caring more about the developers. So it was actually in my late teens, I got a Sega Nomad that I used to keep myself from falling brain dead working as a security guard. I did overnight shifts, and it was like deathly boring, right? So I picked up a Nomad, and I bought a whole bunch of Genesis games, a whole bunch that I either played when I was a kid or I wanted to play, and one of them was Thunder Force 4, aka Lightning Force.
Quest for Dark Star.
Quest for the Dark Star. Jesus Christ.
Who came up with this?
Well, they
I
got
don't know,
it's
man.
a dark star, so they got to lighten it. That makes sense to me.
I must
Thank
imagine.
you, Arnie. All explained.
I must imagine that it was a bunch of chimps in a room and they just had a bunch of words and the chimps just started like throwing up words all over.
Yeah, it was like Mad Libs for video games.
My secret video game dream is to kickstart a shoot 'em up and then just name it Lightning Force 2.
Do you think you'll get into some IP issues if you do that? Because I wonder if anyone actually cares about the US
That's
name.
what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if Technosoft or Sega or whoever owns that IP at this point would
It's
care.
Sega owns it.
If you use that particular title.
Well, the thing is, the title for the Switch release, it actually has both titles. So I imagine in order to use it, they have to renew the IP, the trademark. So yes, I think you will get into hot water with that. But hey, you could just change it to add an E at the end of lightning. So,
Oh, dude, and then it'll be like oldie time English.
yes. Maybe that's what they were trying to go for, Paul. Maybe it was a future so advanced that it was retro. So who knows?
That's just another level now.
That is just Inception within lightning.
That's like Three-Eyed Raven talk right now.
We're actually recording this on the day of the last episode of Game of Thrones. So if you hear a few Game of Thrones references, we're going to immediately date ourselves. So there you go.
But I pledge no spoilers.
Okay. Actually, I just want to mention that you mentioned the Sega Nomad. So I imagine as soon as you said that, Arnie got a little twinkle in his eye because that's the only Genesis he knew.
That's right.
Yep.
I love that giant brick. I'm assuming
me
you had
too, man.
the AC adapter for it, because otherwise you must have burned 100 million batteries in your on
Can you
your
imagine,
shifts.
without getting
I
into too much,
100% had the adapter.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
without getting into too much of a digression here, do you imagine how many batteries are in India right now in a landfill, and how many kids have gotten cancer from these batteries? Probably because you had to play your Sega Nomad.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Oh, dude, they have one landfill for for batteries, and then another larger landfill just for Sega Nomad batteries.
I mean, here's the thing: you have to think
Nomad and
about
Lynx.
it. You have to think about it in the context, right? At one point, there was the Nomad, the Lynx, the Turbo Express, and the Game Boy, just consuming what must have been Duracell stock. Must have been through the roof during this time.
I imagine 5%
yeah.
of their profits was just going to portable game
That's
consoles.
when that damn rabbit was going around hitting that drum.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a dated reference.
That's
Such a dated reference.
Listen, we are dated by definition. That's actually part of our
right?
identity. Let's just call ourselves seasoned and aged. We're like a very fine wine that has turned to vinegar.
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good analogy.
That is an excellent analogy.
Anyways, now that we've completely gone off the rails again, Anthony, when did you first learn of Technosoft, and were you aware of them back in the day?
The first Technosoft game I ever played was Thunder Force 2. But
Okay.
I wasn't really paying attention to the actual company. You know?
I don't think most people were.
Yeah, it was funny because over the years I was playing these games, I realized, oh, these are all Technosoft games.
Yeah, and on top of that, you may have just thought, well, this is just a Sega game.
Right.
And because it was on the Genesis, you were like, yeah, Sega puts this game out.
Back then, you weren't really thinking about
Who's actually building
making this
the
game.
experience that you're enjoying, and who will actually spend 20 hours of their day making sure that you got a good game to play.
Yeah, I'm a piece.
No,
of
they don't
shit.
care about them.
But
we don't care about any of them.
But it was funny because back then, this must have been a '90s thing. But anything with techno in it just sounded so futuristic.
Hell yeah.
Right? If you put techno in everything, it was just yo, I gotta see what this is about.
And then the Techno Viking came out, and everyone realized that maybe we shouldn't use techno anymore.
There was not to be too off rails, but speaking of techno, remember that game? It was on the Genesis, Techno Cop.
No,
Dude,
I don't.
Heard of it? No.
Techno Cop busted.
Look it up because it was the most violent game they were so afraid to release.
Dude,
It's
couldn't you murder
16-bit.
children in that game?
I think so.
And I think the kids were black too. Like you could murder like black kids in that game.
I'm not even touching that. I am just staying out of those waters.
So India, huh?
It was so violent they had to add techno to the name, so parents thought that they were actually shooting down robots or something.
Oh man,
I don't know, man. It's actually also not a good game.
No,
like,
no, it's a terrible game.
Bad.
Yeah. But it was like so much controversy. But yeah, that's when the techno just stuck in my head.
Yeah,
in the 90s.
That's a bad game to get stuck with. I would not race that game.
Maybe
anymore.
that's why I don't blocked out Technosoft. I was like, nope.
Jack Thompson probably has that game on his shelf. He just looks at it and says, "I could have stopped you, but I didn't."
I could have made so much money off of this.
How about you, Arnie? Any thoughts on Technosoft and when you first became aware of them?
I first became aware of Technosoft. How long have we been recording now?
11 minutes ago.
11 minutes ago. We actually just brought Arnie. He just like literally woke up and we told him, "Hey, you want to join the podcast?" He said, "Sure." What are we talking about? It's like, "Oh, Technosoft. Oh, you want to talk about techno music?"
I'm contractually obligated to be on every episode of this podcast, regardless of my knowledge.
He doesn't even care anymore.
But no, I had heard of Technosoft before, in that I'd heard of some of the games that they'd made, specifically Thunder Force. And I briefly played some of the later entries. I think I played Thunder Force 5 and 6 when I was like a lot younger. But like in the research for this episode, I've realized that I desperately need to play a lot more Technosoft games, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Just circling back to me, I actually first heard of Technosoft actually through Paul. So some I think it was probably like a year ago. We were doing a theme week, I think, for Instagram, and it was about video game music. And of course, Paul put the intro to Thunder Force 4. Oh, yeah. And as soon as I heard those rocking riffs, I was just like, I really need to play this right now. And I need to know what the hell this is. And then, to my surprise, because that was just the intro, some days later, Paul actually posts the #1 song, Metal Squad. And as soon as I heard Metal Squad, I said, that's it. This is my calling. I need to play Thunder Force 4. And it wasn't until a year later that I actually played it. But in any event, it really led me down a rabbit hole of wanting to learn more about the developer and really seeing what it is that they did. Because, to be honest, the Genesis period kind of passed me by. I was in Cuba back then, so I had seen Genesis games. I had seen Streets of Rage, Shinobi, Sonic, all those games that we know and love from the Genesis era, but I actually did not have a lot of experience with the Genesis growing up. So I knew Super Nintendo, but really Genesis was kind of a really blind spot for me. So I was completely hopeless in knowing anything about this obscure developer that made shoot 'em ups. So I guess that's a good way to segue into who and what actually was Technosoft. So as we have said, they were a Japanese game development company. They were formally founded in 1982, even though they date a little bit earlier than that. And they were in Nagasaki, so they were in the south of Japan. So they were really known for its graphically advanced games. They really pushed the graphical boundaries of the time. And I think all their games, for the most part, all have really, really great soundtracks. So if you had to talk to someone about Technosoft, it's basically great graphics, a lot of effects and sprites, and kick-ass freaking soundtracks. Yeah. So, in particular, as you have heard, they're really known for the Thunder Force series. Thunder Force being a series of shoot 'em up games that really had their heyday in the Genesis era. And they're also known for Herzog's Y, which we have mentioned before. And this was an early proto-real-time strategy game that served as an influence for other later real-time strategy games like Warcraft and Command and Conquer. So a few of the main figures for Technosoft, the precedent for the duration of its existence, which was basically from 1982 to 2002, essentially, is Tomio Osono. And really there's not much known about him. He was pretty much always behind the scenes. He was kind of the guy that made everything work and kept the lights running, but he wasn't really involved in development. So you don't really know much about him. And unfortunately, we're not going to know too much more about him because he sadly died in 2014. So there's not much that we can discern from him. Another one of their main figures was Kotori Yoshimura, who was actually born Katsunori Yoshimura. She actually underwent a sex reassignment surgery, so that's a little bit, of a quirk in trying to learn more about her. But she was a co-founder of the company, and pretty much everyone that speaks about her say that she was an absolute genius, and she was actually the designer of the original Thunder Force and a few of the other early games. She actually left the company in 1985, and she founded this other company called Arsis Software, which, if you're a Japanese developer that came of age around the 80s and was into PCs, then you were probably really influenced by one of her games. So, for example, Hideki Kamiya was really influenced by Star Cruiser, which was one of her more advanced games, which was actually kind of like a first-person shooter, like a very early first-person shooter. Eventually, they developed or co-developed Air Combat, Gran Turismo, Omega Boost before dissolving. But that's really an entire different episode. But really, one of the fun trivia facts about this is that she was actually one of the co-founders. Wow. And the other guy that you're going to hear a lot about throughout this episode is Naosuke Arai. And Arai was actually the music programmer and composer, sound designer for a lot of the games, even though they had two other composers who are actually the ones that we know for their music. Arai was really involved in the music programming, and he started actually from when Technosoft was not even a company, and was one of the sole employees to stay there until its closing. So a lot of the things we know about Technosoft come from Arai himself. So he actually started working for Technosoft part-time as a student in the 1980s, and really made it up through the ranks in there under the tutelage of Ozono-san. So eventually he directed Thunder Force 5, so he really moved up the ladder there. So that's pretty much the main figures. Anything you guys want to say about those, or?
Well, I just want to say I'm so happy Ozzy's pronouncing these names, because I would have just butchered them so bad.
Yeah,
this is terrible.
I also think it's really cool that I love hearing about Japanese developers in particular from that era, because it seems like most of them started in game shops.
Yeah.
So you have you have Ozono-san. He's this older guy. He's got a computer store where he sells computers and software and hardware. And then you have these kids coming in after school and basically kind of borrowing the computers and doing their own programming and so on and so forth. And then eventually some of these game stores, I'm thinking of Falcom specifically. Falcom's history, which we've gone over in a previous episode, which you should download. It's really good. That development of these houses, of these development houses, is really cool. Like the fact that they're stores and you just have kids having fun and then bam, you become a developer and you have a catalog of games and you're influencing an entire generation of other kids.
Yeah. I want to say, I could be completely wrong, but I want to say that the Arai story sounds really similar to Satoru Iwata's story, because I think that was sort of what happened to him too. He got started coding at like a very young age and learning how to program and stuff at like these PC shops, and eventually created HAL Laboratory and did all that. So I think that is, like Paul was saying, that's a very common thing for these early Japanese developers. And it's really cool to see that as a kid, you could run into somebody like this and they'd sort of tell you I'm going to help you get to where you want to be, and I'm going to help you do these things. Because I feel like as a kid, if I told my parents I wanted to program video games, they would have told me I was insane.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, 100%.
But if it's an after school activity that you do, it's just, rather than going out and causing a ruckus, you just go to a computer store and learn how to program in BASIC.
Yeah.
That's really, doing something worthwhile with your time, really.
Absolutely.
And that's, like you said, Paul, I kind of see this episode as some sort of sister episode to the Falcom episode, because there are so many parallels. Because they both, the companies, both of them started at a computer shop, and in the case of Technosoft, it was called the Sasebo Micon Center, because it was based in Sasebo City in Nagasaki Prefecture. And other companies like Hudson also started out in computer shops, and we got to realize that at the time computers were quite expensive, so not everyone really had access to them. So if you were a kid, you weren't just going to go up to your parents and say, "Hey, I want a computer so I can learn how to code in BASIC." because computers were actually seen as a work tool. They were actually seen as something for salarymen in order to be more efficient in the time and see their kids a lot less.
So
That
nothing's
is the
changed.
goal.
Nothing has really changed,
nothing's changed.
as I know now by my job.
But it's really cool though. I mean, like you said, like just seeing how this all came about in the 80s, like the way there was so much support, so much like mentoring.
Yeah.
And it's something you won't see as much now, but back then it was just, since it was so new and everything, it was like, look at these kids. It's coming, like you said, coming in and just kind of learning. And, there was this respect toward their elders, and they paid it forward. It's really cool.
Yeah. It's
and the elders also, sorry to interrupt you, Ozzy, but the elders also had nothing to lose.
No,
right?
absolutely.
Right.
Nowadays, you'll probably have a senpai who is, a producer, or in the USA, whatever, right? You have these guys who are producers. They might not necessarily be interested in mentoring the kids who are gunning for their jobs, right?
Yeah.
Because now this is an industry and it's lucrative, and people at the top, they have something to lose. But back then, whether it was in the USA or Japan, nobody had anything. There's nothing to lose. So just mentor the kids, whatever.
Yeah,
because these guys created this industry, this scene that is what it is now. Like, these were the sort of the vanguard of this whole movement.
Yeah. And it's actually, after Ozono-san died, there was a memorial dedicated by Arai. And Arai actually spoke about how grateful he was to Ozono for just kind of giving him a chance and letting him just kind of play around with the computers and getting him into the field. So it's actually kind of a really feel-good story, but I think at the time people didn't even realize what they were gaining with it. And it's just kind of really interesting to see that that's kind of a time long gone. I don't think we're going to see that again, at least not in the field of computers, because it was just such a nascent field at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as we mentioned, it started out as a computer shop, I think around 1979. And they started developing some of their custom games. So the way that it kind of worked was just like that. Someone like Arai would come and they would start to learn how to code, or someone like Yoshimura would come and they would just start like developing their own game. And what they would do is they had like mail order games. And that's how I think everyone back in the day kind of, distributed their games. They were just kind of like, hey, call us and we'll send you this really cool game that we built. So for someone like Ozono, it was just like all win, because it just kind of brought a little bit more publicity to the shop and to the company, etc. And actually, whenever they would mail out the games, they would just put Technosoft on it. And Technosoft is actually a riff on this band called Yellow Magic Orchestra, which seems to have influenced every single game developer back in the 80s. And also the word techno was just cool back in the day, as Anthony has mentioned. And so they just wanted to put something cool, and so Technosoft. And by the way, you're going to see a lot of different spellings of Technosoft. Sometimes it's with an H, sometimes it's without an H, sometimes it's separated, sometimes it's not. I'm just going to forget consistency. It doesn't really matter when we're talking. So that's a good thing. But some of their first few games were very simple, and a lot of them were like educational programs. So one of them was a typing instructor. Another one was a golf game called Golf Island. And Arai actually created a backgammon game, which he completely designed and programmed. I think the first big game was one of the games called Snake in Snake, which was a single screen action game in which the player controls a snake that has to kill other snakes. I don't actually know how this works because I haven't seen videos of this. That's one of the unfortunate parts of talking about an obscure Japanese game developer. A lot of this never really left Japan, so it's kind of difficult to find video on this thing. So we just kind of have to imagine what this would have been like. So think about this little green line just going around and trying to eat other little lines or something like that. But really where they kind of first established themselves was with the first Thunder Force game. Around the time Xevious was extremely popular. It was actually developed by Namco. So everyone was really interested in the shoot 'em up genre, and Xevious was the one that popularized that genre. And Thunder Force was a multi-directional shoot 'em up scrolling game, so you could basically go anywhere, up, down, left, right. So it wasn't like it was scrolling and you had to, go on a set path. It's very rudimentary. If you see it nowadays, it just looks old. I'm sorry to say.
I'll bet.
And does not show off the musical ability of Technosoft as well as their later games do.
Absolutely not. No. It's a lot of bleeps and bloops, unfortunately. It was actually published in 1983, and like we said, was pretty much the brainchild of Yoshimura-san. And she designed and programmed the game. It was published on some of the Japanese computers, like the Sharp X1, and later was ported to the inferior NEC PC-88. One of the things that I've seen in the interviews, etc., is how many developers just shed on the PC-88. But the thing is, it was the most popular computer at the time because it was just cheaper. But a lot of developers really hated to have to port their games to the PC-88. So if you're looking for like videos of the original Thunder Force, look for it on the Sharp X1. That's the better looking one, although that's not saying much nowadays. But Paul, have you ever heard of the original Thunder Force? I don't think you've played it, most likely.
No, it's the white whale, right? Like I started like Anthony. Actually, no, I started with Thunder Force 4, but then I went back and got 2 and 3 very shortly afterwards. And I remember being like, "Where's Thunder Force?" And it wasn't until years later that I found out it existed. And because it's only available on Japanese PCs, I never played it. It's always been kind of like the elusive. But because it's not a side scroller, I never really cared that much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a fundamentally different game from the later games that it's almost like you're not missing out on a lot if you don't play it. There's really fundamentally no story, so it doesn't really matter in terms of the lore, if we want to say, of Thunder Force.
It is a really cool, like, because it's a free roaming shooter like that, it's very, like, when I looked it up, what I saw on the screen was not what I was expecting to see.
Yeah. And it was very graphically advanced for the time.
Yeah.
It really did a lot with what little they had at the time. And really came down to Yoshimura's coding and her technical expertise. But really, this game nowadays just seems almost like a curiosity of time and something that we should preserve for history, but not necessarily something that we want to go back to or that deserves a remaster or anything.
We're good.
I think we'll pass. We'll pass. But no, but it was seminal and it was popular for the time, and it really kind of established Technosoft back in the heyday. Another game they came out with in the early days was one called Plasma Line, and this one was another one developed by Yoshimura, and it actually is like a space race game. Where you avoid obstacles, etc., like asteroids. And it actually was, apparently by all accounts, the first polygonal 3D game in a PC. So that's kind of a pioneering aspect of Technosoft, that they actually had the first. Everyone back in the day used wireframes. So if you look at the Vectrex, it's all wireframes. But this one was actually polygonal graphics. So it's really, if you look at it now, I looked at some videos on YouTube. I don't know if you guys did as well.
I did.
It's awful. I was looking at it and I was like, I do not know what is happening here.
Well, that's what I was going to say is when I looked it up, like the sound of it is like, I could not listen to it for more than like a minute or two.
Oh yeah. And it keeps looping.
Yes.
And it's nauseating.
Yes. And then, but
well, we're not really doing a good job of like talking about
Technosoft, so we really love this company.
The good stuff is coming, guys. But the thing that I thought was really interesting was the way the game is set out. Like, I also had no idea what was going on, but it looked like it also let you move in not just side to side like a normal racer, but because you're in space, it also lets you move like up and down to avoid obstacles. So it adds that like that other layer of dimension on top of just the normal axes that you get with like regular like racers at the time. But it's just rough. Like, yeah,
it's super rough. I did not, for the life of me, figure out what was happening on the screen.
And I want to say that most of that is due to it having these polygonal graphics, because that must be taking up so much of the processing
absolutely.
power of what this game is.
Yeah,
is doing,
it's running at like 1 frame per second, literally. It's it's like a slideshow. I'm not kidding.
But it's a cool history lesson now, though, right?
Oh,
it's
now that we've seen the promised land.
No, and I think it should be
To look
preserved.
back, yeah.
I absolutely think that it's something that we need to, I don't know if venerate, but at the very least, look back on it like...
Let's not do that.
Yeah. Let's not put it on a pedestal, guys.
No.
But at the very least, recognize the importance of what they did.
Yeah, like what they were pushing at the time, what they were achieving back in 85.
84,
you know?
yeah.
Yeah,
Everybody was all playing Pac-Man and,
and they're just like, well, let's just go to space.
yeah, let's give everybody a seizure. Let's go. Let's do this.
Yeah,
guys.
I mean,
Let's do this.
it reminds me a lot of later games like Elite, for example, which came out in the West, and just in that kind of space setting. Except Elite was a lot more in depth, and you actually went throughout the galaxy entirely. But I would have liked to know if this games had come out here in the U.S., what sort of effect they would have had, and it's pretty amazing to see that the games just kind of were developed, you know, it's almost like what happens in evolution, that even though they're in different islands, they kind of develop the same traits.
Right.
They were both kind of looking to build upon the same things, even though one was, you know, thousands and thousands of miles apart, and it was a very insulated country.
Yeah.
But
I think the lesson of Plasma Line is somebody had to do it first. And a lot of the times when you're the first to do something, you're not the best to do it.
No, and let's also mention that something like Elite was actually in wireframe. So it's not like they were trying to push polygons. So that's another feather in Plasma Line's cap. But by 1985, a lot of developers actually left Technosoft to form Archer Software, and among them was Yoshimura. So it was kind of an all-star team that left, and they went on to do great things that were very influential. But a lot of the new kids that were joining the group were really disappointed to hear that Yoshimura had left, because back in the day, you wanted to work where there was a good mentor, because there wasn't really a coding school or a programming school. So the only real way to learn and improve your skills was to learn under a good mentor. And when they realized that Yoshimura wasn't there, they were pretty pissed off. So fun fact, a lot of them actually ended up coding secret messages into their games, just to voice their displeasure, which is such a Japanese thing to do. It's just like, well,
So
we're just
salty.
going to go out of the way to make something that no one is going to find out, but we just have to put it out there. And I actually read some of his translations, and they're pretty salty, man. they're pretty bad. It's kind of like, I haven't slept in like 24 days, and I haven't seen my family. I don't have enough money. I'm living off of like, you know, barely making ends meet. Our games are never going to be as good as Konami's game. If they give me like a job, I am going to go right to them right away. I hate everything about this company. Literally, it was like that.
I didn't realize that Technosoft was also behind Red Dead Redemption 2. That's crazy.
Guys, whoever hasn't listened to all our episodes will be so lost at all this reference.
Well, there you go. Got to download.
Yeah. But really, they really were just well known for their PC games. They did not dabble in consoles, so they weren't doing anything for the Famicom, etc. So just running through the PC years, we have a few games that I'm just gonna kind of go through, and then we can talk about them. D-Dash was a game that could be seen as a survival horror game that was released in 1987. It was inspired by Alien and The Thing, and The Thing. And it had 2-player capabilities. So one of the very early survival horror games. Unfortunately, as Arnie and I discussed, it's almost impossible to find out anything about this game.
Yeah.
Because the way that you spell it is literally with a D and the dash at the end. And, you know, it's impossible to search on Google for something like this, beyond the fact that it never came out outside of Japan. So for now, we can only imagine what this game involved. It's kind of like overhead. So imagine kind of like a Metal Gear look. And
Snakes eating snakes,
maybe. And I suppose I can only imagine that there were kind of monstrous things running after you. I mean, I don't know. This is all like, you know,
Yeah.
I'm basing this on circumstances. What do you call this? God, words are failing me today. But yeah, another game was Campsite. It was a really ambitious game, and Adai really looks back fondly upon this game. It used kind of like basic-like language in which the players could code their tanks in order to battle other tanks. So essentially it was a coding game. And you would send your tank programs to Technosoft through BBS, which is short for Bulletin Board System, which was kind of like the way to exchange information back in the day for those of us that didn't grow up in that age. And they would run the programs against each other and run rankings. And, essentially whoever had the best program would be ranked at the top. So really it was one of the early forms of online gaming. And, funnily enough, there are people still playing the game today through emulators. So that's kind of a cool little tidbit. Another one, Feedback, released 1988 for the MSX2. Not much to say about this one. It's kind of like Space Harrier, except worse. It doesn't really look great. The MSX2 was not very good in terms of scrolling, so it looks very rudimentary, unfortunately. And just to run one last one before I kick it back to you guys, Herzog also came out in 1988 for the MSX2, and this was the first game before Herzog Zwei, which was actually the sequel. And again, one of the earliest real-time strategy game titles, but it really had less real-time strategy as Herzog Zwei, and it just served as a foundation for its sequel. You basically controlled mechs, and you had to go back and forth between bases, etc. So, I can't tell you a lot about it because I don't quite get what's going on when I see it. I think I have to play it in order to kind of figure out what's going on with it. But it's a fun little, interesting experiment, and I imagine for the time was, very, very appealing. So I want to kick it back to you guys. Ani, what do you think of these early titles, and which of these would you most be interested in playing?
I mean, of the ones that I saw, I'd probably be most interested in playing Feedback, because that's the one that looked, one, the most straightforward, and two, the most video game-y of these. Herzog looked impressive, specifically in, the amount of things you can have on screen at once, because I remember the long play I was watching, there was, 20, 30 unit sprites on screen at one time. Because basically you just create units and then you have your mech, you can transport them where you want, or they'll just eventually get to where they need to go to attack and do stuff like that. But Herzog just seemed a little convoluted to me, whereas Feedback, it is a Space Harrier sort of deal. So I was immediately oh, I know exactly what everything is and what's going on.
Yeah, what about you, Anthony?
I wish I could see what D-Dash looked like.
Yeah.
So curious, man.
Yeah, same with me. Apparently, everyone back in the day in Japan was very influenced by Alien. So a lot of people just threw a bunch of horror elements because of Alien. So nice to see that there was such a heavy Western influence in terms of horror.
Yeah, I'd be so curious to see that one though. But I'm with Arnie about Feedback though.
Yeah,
sounds like the easiest one to just jump in and kind of know.
Yeah, I don't care about Feedback.
I
honestly didn't think it looked as bad as you're saying.
I don't know, dude. I mean, the thing is, again, the MSX2 is not great for fast scrolling. It really did not have a good frame rate. Because it didn't have a lot of processing power, but again, I mean, it looks interesting. You play like a robot and, you shoot scaling enemies that come toward you. But what about you, Paul? What do you think?
No doubt about it. Campsite. I would play Campsite today if I could.
Really?
Yeah.
I grew up with BBS's.
Really?
Because I'm old. And
it pays off to have you, man. It's good to send you an apple juice every week.
Prune, please, prune.
Yes, it helps with your prostate
for digestion.
But dude, BBS games were when I was in high school. BBS games were the greatest thing because it's exactly as you described, Ozzy. You input sort of commands, but not in a basic language. Most BBS games had menus, and you select what your empire does or what your player character does. And you select those actions from the menus, and you get a limited amount of them each day. And everybody in this game inputs all those commands at some point during the course of the day. And then at the end of the day, all those commands resolve. and you see the results of it. And then you just repeat it the next day. But the great thing about them was that they were super social. So my friends and I, we would go to school, we'd talk about like all the commands that we're going to put in and how we can work together to beat the crap out of other teams. And let me tell you, man, BBS games, it's an unfortunate thing that is gone because it was such a unique kind of game. They all looked like shit. It was all ASCII graphics. Yeah. But that wasn't the point. The point was that you kind of collaborate with your friends and you do something and then you wait. And, you know, nowadays we're not very good at waiting, but back then waiting was cool, man. Like,
it was anticipation.
There was anticipation. Yeah. It created a real sense of anticipation, you know, the word we just used. ComSite actually sounds like an old school BBS game, possibly even better because you're using a programming language. So it's edutainment. So I would play that in a heartbeat.
I kind of think nowadays when I look at something like Media Molecule Streams, which is now in beta and still to be released, and that it's essentially kind of a game development suite. I just think that people nowadays just don't have that level of attention anymore. They want everything kind of easy. And as you say, Paul, back in the day, we were better at waiting. And part of the waiting is actually taking the time to learn how to play a game and how to code. And I think that's something that is very interesting that we don't really do much of anymore. But I think even back in the day, ComSite was extremely hardcore. I don't think you had the Mario crowd playing ComSite and they were just like, man, I really like this plumber jumping. I am going to go and code a tank. I don't think that was the case, but damn it, it sounds so cool. It sounds cool that you could essentially create a program and you could pin it against other programs in all of Japan and say, wow, I am like number 5 in the entirety of Japan with my program. That to me, if I had been a kid back in Japan in those days, it would have just been the coolest.
And it's also the only one of these games that none of us have ever played before. We've all played a D-Dash, a Feedback, a Herzog.
That's true.
None of us have ever played ComSite.
Yeah. It's funny to think. I mean, Arai looks back very fondly upon ComSite. He was really surprised in one of the interviews when he saw that people were actually playing it on emulators, and he was just like, who would want to play any of these old games? I'm very humbled and honored that they want to play these games. It's very, very Japanese, of course, but it's really nice. I think that ComSite really was something that I would have liked to have experienced back in the day. But with that said, we're just going to take a quick break. We've gone a little bit long, so we're going to be right back in a few seconds. Alright guys, and we're back. And now we're going to talk about when Technosoft actually came into its own. So before this, they were all PC oriented and they were, kind of a niche, obscure company that not many people knew about, even in Japan. And so with Thunder Force 2 that came out in 1988, all of that kind of changed because all of a sudden Technosoft blew up and Thunder Force 2 being a shoot 'em up was extremely popular. And so that kind of put Technosoft in the limelight. It actually came out originally on the Sharp X68000, which I try to remember how to pronounce.
Which is the best name for a computer ever.
Absolutely. Because why not go with the highest number you can pronounce?
Hell yeah.
And it was later ported to the Genesis Mega Drive in 1989, which was really where it got a lot of its popularity. And it was so well received that the entire team at Technosoft was worried that they would mess it up with a sequel. So they didn't want to lose that momentum. But unfortunately, it also meant that they were not able to create something as hardcore as ComSite again, which Arai kind of laments. So It's unfortunate that, with success, it also brought them a little bit less freedom to do interesting and cool things, which you're kind of seeing now with other developers like From Software. From Software was always like doing cool, niche, quirky games. And now all of a sudden, whenever they develop a new game, it has to be this big event, and it has to be a Souls-like or something, and something like Déraciné is not common. It's kind of like the exception, and it has to be like the small little game. So it's something that, it's kind of the sacrifice you have to make for success. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting time period. But during this time period, Ozono thought that it would be easy to transition to development for the Mega Drive because both the Mega Drive and the X68000 actually shared a CPU and FM sound chip. Of course, thinking that it was easy did not mean that it was actually easy, and I actually think that they may have bitten off a little bit more than they could chew, but ultimately they were able to pull it off, and it was one of the earliest games on the Genesis Mega Drive. So I just want to kick it to you, Paul. Thunder Force 2, I heard that you originally played this game. How do you come to learn of it, and what do you think of it at the time?
It was just at a friend's house, right? And I didn't think very much of it, to be honest with you, because it's not like I played it right when the Genesis came out. I think it might have actually been a launch title in the US.
It was.
There were like 6 games, and Thunder Force 2 was one of them.
Yeah,
but
Space Harrier 2, Alter Beast, Thunder Force 2, I think Sonic
Tommy
was
Lasorda Baseball.
No, Sonic was not. Sonic was not. Sonic came out.
Tommy Lasorda, though, that was...
Yeah, Tommy Lasorda Baseball was.
It's like one of the forgotten ones.
Not Evander Holyfield. Buster Douglas, boxing.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Guys, we're going to be so wrong in like all of these.
If we got 2 out of those right, we're good.
So in any case, I didn't play it until, a few years into the life cycle of the Genesis. And by then I had already played other shoot 'em ups that were frankly better, like Blazing Lasers on the TurboGrafx, for example. So I didn't really think too much of it. It wasn't until later on when I played Lightning Force and then got Thunder Force 3 and Thunder Force 2 that I was able to appreciate it a little bit more with a more, I guess, cultured eye. But at the time, I didn't really think too much of it.
Yeah, and it's the fact that shoot 'em ups at the time were a dime a dozen. There were just so many of them that it was just kind of easy to have them get lost in the shuffle.
Oh yeah, I think that I was watching a retrospective of Thunder Force on YouTube. It's a really good one done by Stray Fox. And I think he mentions at some point that the Genesis library has like 70 something shoot 'em ups. Like they weren't these like really rare sort of genre. This was like a popular thing in this time frame.
Yeah, it was massive. Their library of shmups, especially when you compare it to something like a Super Nintendo, because Super Nintendo could not really push this fast-scrolling graphics as much. Yeah. So the Genesis really was capable of doing that. So a lot of the games that came out were shmups. So if you were a shmups fan, you pretty much played it on the Genesis or on the TurboGrafx, because the Super Nintendo really wasn't where it was at.
Yeah.
Anthony, what about you? Did you play Thunder Force 2 back in the day?
Yeah, similar experience to Paul. A friend of mine had it, and he throws it on, and like you said, it was like they were a dime a dozen. So the first level, right? Was it the first level? It was like overhead.
Yeah.
Right. So I was kind of like, oh, okay, like whatever, right? All I could think about was like games like 1943 and whatnot at the time,
Yeah,
But I'll tell you, the thing that I loved most about playing the game was the soundtrack.
Yeah, the soundtrack was good. At that point, Technosoft was already killing it on the soundtrack.
And my friend's father had this a very rare thing called surround sound in his room, right? And when this game would come on, and we would go on to see this in every other Technosoft game after that, the soundtracks for these games, the sound in this game, the effects and everything were just so way ahead of everything else.
Yeah, it's a funny thing because I think we mentioned it many times before in the past, but the Genesis gets a lot of flack for its sound chip, but there are so many of its games that were more known for their soundtrack, such as Streets of Rage and Thunder Force, that it's kind of crazy to think that people still shit on the Genesis sound chip.
Yeah, there's something about those early Genesis titles that, for whatever reason, to me, in my memory, they had way better soundtracks than later games.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but I could see where you're coming from a nostalgia perspective.
These guitar riffs in those, like, you know, like you had to, the strength of the Genesis in the sound department was, so to me, was in those guitar riffs.
Yeah.
Rise from your grave. I mean, that's all you need to hear.
But that's what I always remember from those early Genesis games, and games like Thunder Force 2 were like those riffs were just like, oh man, they sounded so good, you know?
Yeah, I think Thunder Force 2 was almost like the perfect bridge because it still incorporated the overhead multi-directional elements of the first Thunder Force, but you kind of alternated between levels, and one of the levels was the overhead level, and the other level was what we would later come to know as Thunder Force, which was the side-scrolling level from left to right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of introduced a lot of the hallmarks of the Thunder Force series, such as the selectable weapons, the changing speeds, etc.
Yeah.
So
it's also interesting to see, like, as you go further down the line of Thunder Force, like how Thunder Force 1 was like a free roaming shooter, Thunder Force 2 mixes in overhead and side scrolling, and then by the time you get to Thunder Force 3, I think it's all side scrolling at that point, right?
Yeah. Thunder Force 3 was just completely all side scrolling. And I think it was a good move.
We know how to do this one thing. Let's just do the one thing extremely well.
Yeah, you could totally see their evolution.
Yeah, no, for sure.
From each game, you know, and then they just settled by Thunder Force 3, which I guess we'll talk about later more, so I don't want to...
Yeah, no, you don't need to...
I don't want to spoil it. No spoilers. No spoilers.
You don't need to cordon off your stuff. But yeah, no, it's really them, Technosoft, kind of evolving with the time. And we also got to realize that a lot of these developers were like young kids.
Yeah.
They were really learning the ropes as they made their games. Mm-hmm. So it's a game that I haven't played yet, Paul, and I'm sad to say that. But it's not that expensive. So if you want to get it on the original hardware and you just want like the cart, it's probably not going to run you more than like $20. So I would say pick it up if you're interested. It has good music. The side scrolling levels are pretty kick ass. And I can't speak much to the overhead levels. Maybe you can, Paul, because I haven't played it, but
they're not great.
Yeah.
It's nothing. There's nothing to write home about there. It's definitely a first gen 16-bit game.
Yeah.
There's no other way to describe it, right? Like it's almost like a prototype for what would come later. So, you know, given that our gaming time is so valuable now, you play Thunder Force 2 just kind of as a history lesson.
Yeah.
And even then, you could probably just glean the same kind of experience from watching it on YouTube. I hate to say it, but you know, if you're gonna play one of these games, play 3 or 4, and that's just a better use of your time.
Yeah, and I do wonder though if Sega, by some chance, let's say they release, you know, Thunder Force 3 in the future, if they could just include Thunder Force 2 as well there, just kind of like as an add-on.
Yeah,
that would be great.
That would be fantastic because it allows you to like dip your toes in there, but not necessarily have to like, you know, plop down $8 to buy a new one. You know, it's kind of like justifying buying Alex Kidd in Miracle World. You know, it's kind of hard to.
How dare you? Every time this guy.
I'm sorry. I had to get that in, Paul. Now it's just to like, you know, bust your balls a little bit.
I think that it's very well established that Paul is the Alex Kidd guy and Ozzy is clearly the Keith Courage and Alpha Zones guy.
Listen. Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy. That's the type of guy I am.
Oh my God.
You know, it's, I'm sorry, Paul. I do this for jest and for fun, but I know that I come off as the in-house hater here.
So in conclusion, Thunder Force 2, it's very much a first gen game, and it was awesome at the time, but not so much now.
Yeah, thank you for moving me forward, Paul.
You're welcome. No, thank you, Ozzy.
No, let's move forward with.
He just wants to get to the next game on the list.
Yes, I do, because I want to hear Anthony gush about this, because this is that game that Anthony goes to sleep with every night.
I tell my girlfriend, get out the bed. Come on.
Kicks her out.
Time for Herzog. Make room for Herzog.
You know what sway means? 2. And there are too many of us now. Herzog actually in German means Duke, and Zwei means two, so it means Duke 2. So I want to hear from you, Anthony, because this game was pretty influential for you, and we spoke about it the first time that we had you on the podcast as one of like the defining games of your time.
Yeah.
So if you can, just explain what is Herzog Zwei.
So it's funny because I had years later, people would talk about real-time strategy games, and I was like, I can't get into those games. Only to find out I had already done so. So Herzog's Way was okay. So I'm gonna kind of repeat some of the stuff I said on the first time.
Nah, it's fine, man.
But it was one of those games where I had no idea what I was buying. Me and my friend went to Toys R Us to go buy a new game, and we picked up this game because it looked cool. The cover looked really cool.
Yeah. It has a massive robot and
it has
a ship,
a robot in the background,
a
ship flying toward it, and it's like, that's it. I'm sorry.
I mean, what 11-year-old kid wouldn't want to buy that?
I'm in.
Oh,
Right?
100%.
Yeah.
So we go home, we start playing this game, not reading the manual, right? And so now the whole premise is that you're basically a transforming jet, right? You're like, I guess you could call it like a robot transforming into a jet.
They were popular back in the day, so.
Right, yeah, exactly. It pulled me in. So we're thinking, cool, we could just drive this thing around, just turn into a robot and start shooting everything, except within 5 seconds, your vehicle would blow up. Your robot would blow up and go, and it would, I'm failing words now.
Would revert.
It would,
relocate.
Respawn.
That's it. Respawn. A word I didn't know what that meant at the time, right?
Region Free Gamers, the podcast that doesn't have a thesaurus.
We are doing so well with words today. It's amazing. It's the locks.
It is the locks.
So then you would respawn right back at your home base, and it took us forever to figure out what the hell was going on because we refused to learn how to read the manual.
Yeah.
Turns out that you have to now basically it's like a real-time strategy game. You start deploying your troops. You could have a ship. You could have boats, depending on the terrain, I would say, right?
Yeah.
You have boats, you have motorcycles, you have just regular soldiers go on the ground, and you would just direct them to just go and take over another base. And once they would take over that base, you could actually move a little further along on the map. And that's when we were like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah.
This is so cool.
Yeah.
Especially when you have the water levels, because you could just throw ships in the water.
Yeah.
And just direct them. You could direct them to either take over another base or just hold down a fort to defend your base. It was just intense. And
hands down, one of the best split screen 2-player games
without
ever
a doubt.
devised.
Yes.
It's a game that if you had back in the day and you learned how to play it, it could give you endless nights of fun with your friends.
Oh, we played this game. Once we figured out what to do, it was just nonstop.
Yeah.
It was just nonstop mayhem with this game.
What about you, Paul?
I only played it like a few months ago.
Really?
It was after Anthony gushed about it, and I had always wanted to play it, which is to say fairly recently, right? Like as a kid, no fucking idea. No idea this game existed. And even like later on when I had my renaissance with the Genesis, my Genaissance,
Wait, can you say that again?
Wait, that's like an inception because Genesis means origin and Renaissance means rebirth. So you have a birth and rebirth at the same time.
Plus with that French accent, he just said it on.
I want to put Genaissance on a mug or something. I love that.
That's a new hashtag.
I think I will.
Genaissance.
But yes. Later, when I had my Genaissance, I did not know about the Herzog Zwei.
By the way, guys, Paul is not from Montreal. He's from Toronto. So,
oh God, no.
So he has no excuse.
But yeah, no, I had no idea about it. It wasn't until I kind of, started looking at retro gaming again, maybe like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And when I started kind of reading up and learning a bit more specifically about Technosoft, I was like, oh, Herzog's Way, that looks pretty cool. And then Anthony kind of went on about it, and I was like, all right, I got to play this, right? And I got lucky, like I just happened to find one not from a local seller, because I'm not local to anything up here in the Yukon, but anything in Canada I consider local, because I don't have to pay import fees or anything. So I happened to find a local one, got it, and a few months ago I played it with a good buddy for like an hour and a half, and it was hilarious. Like, I wouldn't say that it's aged super well because there are other RTS games that have certainly refined the formula a bit more. But with that said, like, you know, you can't. The other thing about those other RTS games is that they don't have that 16-bit flavor that we all like, that kind of takes us back in time, right? It doesn't have that super fast poppy soundtrack that Herzog's Way has. It's a lot of fun, man. Like, even today, I played it last night just to, like, you know, prepare for this episode, so to speak. And it was still fun, even by myself. Like, I would play it.
Yeah, the surprising thing I find about this game is that I think you hinted at it, Paul, which is that it still feels like a console game despite having real-time strategy elements. It still has those chunky graphics and it feels intuitive like a console game should. It's not like you have to learn an entire new language just to play it like you had to do on PCs. So I think, you know, to those that cared, it was a perfect gateway into real-time strategy games.
Yeah.
What about you, Arnie? Have you actually played through Herzog?
So here's the thing.
That's when you know something's coming.
I owe you
Arnie
an
says,
apology.
Here's the thing.
I owe you an apology, Anthony.
Well, I never
because
get these.
When we had done our episode that you had talked about Herzog's Way, and this is not me criticizing your tastes, but I heard console and real-time strategy game on the Genesis, and I was like, that sounds terrible.
Right.
And then recently, I finally got around to, I've never played it myself, but I got around to watching some gameplay footage of it. And this thing, it looks like one of the dopest games I've ever seen. I was like, I need to play this. Because it just like, the way that they set it up to do the real-time strategy, like, works. I think that's the way to do it for console, where basically when you build your unit, you assign it like the function that you want it to have, whether you want it to go attack a base or you want it to go, you know, do any number of commands. And then instead of having like a cursor or trying to like force a computer RTS control scheme onto a console, you basically have your robot that allows you to sort of pick up and move units wherever you need or you want them. And then you can also, you're not just sort of like a passive dictator of like moving units here and there. Your robot can also attack and destroy units. So it gives you an active role in the game, which I think is like the coolest part about it, is that it's not just, let me strategize like where I want my units to be and how I want to go about attacking my enemies, but I can also like use my robot to give myself a strategic advantage or, you know, do different things that normally you wouldn't be able to do in an RTS. So it looks super cool and it looks like a ton of fun. I'm still wondering how it works split screen wise, because you can see everything that your opponent's doing. They can see everything you're doing.
Yeah, but you're too concerned with minding your own business.
Yeah, that was the thing. It was one of those split screens. You didn't have time to look over to see what they're doing. Because the thing is, you don't know where they were on the map. You couldn't
gotcha.
Unless, you wouldn't be able to tell where they're on the map. So you're just doing your own thing. But it's true what you just said about like your particular player, your role in the match. Because like, you knew you only had a limited amount of time before you would just like blow up and have to respawn back at the main base. But if you knew where to go and just take out something, just sacrifice yourself, you know, just shoot up like one of their tanks that was causing you a lot of damage and then just shoot back, you were fine.
Yeah.
And then there were the cool moments where you would actually face off against the other
mech
player.
Yes.
Yeah, the other mech or whatever. Like, that was cool because you just like start shooting at each other and seeing who blows up faster, you know?
Which the thing I thought was really cool is that like when you're a ship, like when you're the jet plane, you can only shoot at the other player if they're also the jet plane. And the same thing, like if you're the mech, you can only shoot at the other player when they're the mech. And I was like, that's really cool because that adds like another wrinkle to it. I remember seeing people like essentially sort of kiting like enemy units where like they transform into the mech, shoot like 2 or 3 times, then transform into the jet and go back and forth to like destroy things without taking as much damage. And I was like, oh, that's like really cool. Like there's little like strategies that you sort of figure out as you play.
Yeah, it's got a lot of layers to it. But initially it's like so easy to pick up and play once you actually, you know, read the manual.
Read the instructions, yeah.
I'm also with you on
know
that.
you're fucked.
Instructions are for suckers. I only want them in my games so they look nice.
Well, nowadays you don't get instructions at all. You just get a tutorial.
Oh, yeah,
which
you get a pause menu.
Oh man. On a broader scale, Herzog's Way in a nutshell is still to this day why I love the Genesis, probably more than any other system I've ever had, because it was the kind of system that was always just kind of doing stuff like this.
Yeah.
Like in my view, the Super NES was great because it had a really great top end, and it had established genres, and it took those genres and it made them the best possible games, right? Like Final Fantasy was the best possible RPG, Mario was the best possible platformer, and Mario Kart, that was a whole new thing. But the Genesis was doing like all kinds of weird shit, and like Herzog's Way. And I mean, you know what? Technocop, terrible game, but you never saw anything like that on the Super NES. That was like a weird new experience, as bad as it was. So to me, like, Herzog's Way is like pure fucking Genesis. Like that's what this system was all about. It's encapsulated in this game.
Yeah. A few fun facts about Herzog's Way is that Sega asked Technosoft for modem support for the game, so it is possible that in an alternate reality you could have had online capabilities for Herzog's Way,
which would have been amazing.
Insanity. Absolute insanity.
I would never left my chair.
Yes, but it was not feasible at the time, and so they said we can't really do this. Ozono was the one that actually mentioned it. So I think Herzog's Way is one that you should look into, and just as it happens, Sega Ages is going to release Herzog's Way, and it's actually going to have online capabilities.
That is really amazing.
So
holy shit!
Yo, Paul, we got to link up for that one.
Oh my god!
It's Herzog's Way the way that it was always meant to be played.
When I heard about that being released for the Switch, I just thought it was crazy because I was like, who knows about Herzog's Way, right?
Yeah.
But just the fact that Sega's actually like doing that, I'm like,
no, and strangely enough, I said that the first time I learned of Technosoft was with Thunder Force, but the reality is that I had heard of Herzog's Way a long time ago, because it was always, particularly when I started reading about the history of RTSs like Command and Conquer and Warcraft, pretty much everyone mentions Herzog's Way. It's one of the prototypes of the RTS.
And I had no idea. I had no idea that I was that into it early on.
Yeah.
I've never played one since. I've never played a real-time game since.
Well, and the thing is, like, the fact that they are going to release specifically this game on Sega Ages is like a very good example of something we talked about in the Phantasy Star episode, which is that I think Sega, more than any other like major video game developer, publisher, whatever, is really invested in preserving their history. And like a lot of the games that a lot of people don't think about necessarily with these Sega Ages compilations, they're very good at keeping their stuff accessible and available to be played by people in any sort of gen of gaming.
Well, that's the thing, Arnie, which is that Technosoft games kind of languished for a long time because of their insolvency and how their rights went to this pachinko company, which goddamn pachinko.
Goddamn pachinko companies, man.
But Sega was able to license the Thunder Force franchise for Thunder Force 6.
Yeah.
And Sega was eventually able to acquire 21 of their IPs in 2016. So now Sega is actually doing a good job of bringing back these games that were so instrumental for the Genesis.
It's like a love letter to like all these the 16-bit era, really.
Yeah, and what I hope is that Sega releases the next game, which is called Elemental Master. Oh. And Elemental Master came out in 1990, and it was actually released in the US 3 years later in 1993. So by that time, Thunder Force 3 and Thunder Force 4 had already come out, but it was actually made in 1990, so it still does feel a little bit old in terms of how it looks.
Right.
But let me tell you guys, if you guys haven't heard the music for this game, it is freaking fantastic. And I know we say that a lot about Technosoft games, but it's like nightclub music for a game that deals with a sorcerer or magician that is in a fantasy settings and casts magic spells based on the elements. So It's a vertical scrolling shmup. So rather than the Thunder Force horizontal scrolling, it's actually vertical, and you just, your character just kind of goes up and you avoid obstacles, etc. Think of it as gain ground if gain ground scrolled, basically.
It kind of reminded me, like, in the way that it sort of goes, and the fact that you're not like a ship but a dude. It reminded me of, what is the name of that Square Enix game on the NES? It's like Knight something. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where you're a knight and you like essentially do the same thing, like you walk forward and just shoot a whole bunch.
I don't remember, dude.
Oh my god!
I'm sorry to tell you. I'm sorry to tell you. But have any of you guys actually played this?
No, I never did.
No.
Now I need to now though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to now.
It doesn't look absolutely great. It's not one that I would say go out and get it right now. At least it doesn't strike me as that. But it does seem fun, and it does have one thing that would later become a staple of the Thunder Force games, which is that you can actually select your levels. So you can select the order in which you play your levels. And another thing that kind of struck me from it is that it has a lot of cutscenes. It actually has a story, and it has very good drawings, and it actually tells a full-fledged story, which is not something that outside of like Ninja Gaiden you really saw a lot of back in the day. So
no, not very much.
Yeah.
So I'm actually very curious about this one, and especially from the music. And Paul, I hope that you're gonna play a song from Elemental Master in one of the breaks, because everyone needs to listen to how awesome this is. But
Well, I think I kind of have to, don't I?
now you do. I am putting a gun to your head now.
So I found it. It was
All right,
King's Knight. It was
King's Knight.
Yes.
Knight. I don't know that game.
It's
Never heard
it's
of it.
not very well regarded.
Squaresoft.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
But it's a scrolling shooter that they released for the NES in '89 here in America. But it kind of reminded me of that in the sense that, like, there's very few games I feel like where it's vertically scrolling and you're not some sort of vehicle. So that's why I immediately thought of that. But this is, in my opinion, looks a lot better and plays a lot better than that game.
See, because in terms of that type of vertical action games, there were games like Guerrilla War, and Commando and Ikari Warriors, but all of those you actually moved on your own volition.
Yeah, exactly.
With this
like
one, it's automatically scrolling. So it's the same as a shmup, except it just scrolls upward. And the other element that's particular to it is that you play as a dude. You don't play as a ship or anything. So I only wish that you would have been able to practice Kung Fu with a dude, but I guess that was too much. But it's one that's very cheap nowadays. So if you want to grab it, it's only like 20 something bucks CIB. So definitely, if you want to try it, it's one that you should definitely give it a go. Maybe get it on eBay.
Are you sure about that? I thought it was more expensive.
Maybe it is, Paul. Maybe it is.
We don't care about the facts here, Paul.
Where facts don't matter. No, and I don't know. It may be. I found a few cheap ones, but maybe it was just looking at the cartridge only. So
Maybe.
anyways, let's take a quick break, guys, and then we'll come back with a few more games from the Genesis era. Alright guys, and we're back, and I had to admit that I just had a brain aneurysm in the last episode, so that was the reason why I called Elemental Master Sheep, and as it turns out, it's not. It's actually a very expensive game. So I also just got fired when we were offline, so...
And rehired by you, so...
And I hire myself again. But I don't know how much longer I can do this before they take me off that gig. Yeah, it's actually quite an expensive game, apparently, it turns out. So, I don't know. Sega, please release Elemental Master for like $8 so I don't have to pay $200.
That would help.
Or just watch a long play or something.
Yeah.
So, with that out of the way, I guess we can talk about, one of their top tier games, which is Thunder Force 3. And, I'm just going to leave it to Paul Paul, what do you think about Thunder Force 3, which came out in 1990 on the Genesis Mega Drive?
I think it's great, right? But you guys knew I was going to say that, so I have to expand. Basically, if you're not like a hardcore shoot 'em up person, Thunder Force 3 is a fantastic place to start, because it's not the hardest game ever.
No, it's a perfect entry point.
It really is. And it's one of these games, like, the music's good, the controls are good, blah, 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 blah. And it does a lot of cool graphical stuff that at the time on the Genesis or even on the Super NES, you just didn't see. And everybody talks about the heat level, the lava level or whatever you want to call it, with like the background that kind of, waves back and forth. Really cool effect for the time. And you know what? That stuff matters. It still matters.
Yeah.
It looks cool. When I play a game, I want it to look cool.
Yeah.
And Thunder Force 3 accomplishes that. So, if you're kind of intimidated by this genre, but you still want to play a game that'll be fun and kind of take you back to that era, I think this is the way to go.
Yeah, and as you said, Paul, it's definitely easier than Thunder Force 4, Thunder Force 5. It's perhaps the easiest Thunder Force game, and it's not.
It is.
It's not a bullet hell, so it's not like you have to worry about navigating through thousands of bullets, and it just kind of really feels intuitive. I think perhaps the parts that you had to get acquainted with is changing different ship speeds. Oh God, and the variation of weapons and kind of learning each weapon and seeing what they do. So like the cutter, the homing, etc. All of those are kind of self-explanatory. But one of the staples of Thunder Force, which we haven't really talked about, is that enemies can come from forward and behind. So you need to have a lot of situational awareness of, whether enemies come from behind you so that you can change weapons so that you can shoot from behind. And Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but did this game have the same feature as Thunder Force 4 where the screen was much larger and you could go up and down?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, no, I think this one was actually confined, and Thunder Force 4 is the one that started the the much larger screen, and you can scroll it up by going to the top or scroll it down by going to the bottom. I could be wrong about that though. It's been a little while since I played.
No,
3.
I definitely think you're right. And I think that's part of the reason why it's easier. Whereas something like Thunder Force 4, the situational awareness increases tenfold because you just have to keep, in mind a lot more of the off-screen enemies that may come at you.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But you're completely right, Paul, that this is really a perfect entry point into the shoot 'em up genre. It actually came out on the 3DS, but not here in the US. So I actually looked for it, but it was only released as part of the Sega Ages in Japan. Ported by M2, who is kind of like the champion of porting these games to new systems. But Arnie, have you played this one?
I have not played Thunder Force 3, but based on what I've seen of it, I'd have to agree with what you guys are saying. This is a game that, honestly, really takes advantage of every aspect of the Genesis hardware. Graphically, it looks really good. That lava effect that Paul was talking about is even today, to my eyes at least, was super impressive. The fact that was on, a 16-bit system. And then the music is obviously excellent. So, obviously I'd love to play it. So I hope that Sega gives me that opportunity because I'd really like to do that. Sega.
Sega! Did you play this back in the day, Anthony?
Oh, yeah, I played this a lot, man.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, this is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
This was, because it was, I hadn't seen anything like this game on a home console.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this was, because you went from Thunder Force 2, and again, this was also my friend who his father had bought this game, so that's how I played it the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm playing Thunder Force 3, and it was funny because he lent me the game for a few days, and I wound up beating it.
Yeah.
And he could never beat it, so really frustrated him. To this day, he's still mad at me that I beat it before him.
Yeah.
So whatever. And
he'll get over it.
Yeah, it was still 30 years later, he hasn't gotten over it. No, but this game was I just graphically, you hadn't seen stuff like this on I don't know, I hadn't seen anything like this on a Sega Genesis, especially on a home console, arcade stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
But this was this was like amazing to look at, man. And then it became a strategy thing because you had to, once you knew what weapons you needed for what levels and whatnot, you always wanted to hit that hard level first.
Yeah.
So that way it was easier. You didn't want to die on that last level after scrolling through everything, you know?
Yeah.
But a lot of parallax.
A lot of parallax.
A lot of parallax in this game.
Which is one of the things that the group really wanted to do. They felt like they hadn't really tapped into the Genesis Mega Drive's power, and so they really wanted to push the boundaries. And I definitely think that they achieved it.
Oh,
I mean, they went, even further with Thunder Force 4, but with Thunder Force 3, they really proved that they were a force to be reckoned with in developing for the Genesis.
Yeah,
they finally started using that blast processing.
Blast processing.
I mean, when you look at the jump they made from 2 to 3,
it's
you'd
pretty
be like,
impressive.
wow, that's it. But then once you play 4, you're like, holy, what?
Yeah, it's super impressive. And finally, I mean, it was so popular that it's one of the rare games that started out that was developed for a console and then was actually ported to arcades. So it was actually ported to arcades as Thunder Force AC. So it's not very common. You usually see arcade to console conversions, but it's not very common that you see. There are some fighting games that have done that, but not many. So it actually even was ported to the Super Nintendo. And I should mention that its release actually predated the release of the Super Nintendo in 91. But it was released in the Super Nintendo as Thunder Spirits. And unfortunately, it kind of really shows the comparison between the Super Nintendo and the Genesis and what their strengths were. And really, the Super Nintendo was not very strong at doing fast-moving scrolling. It just... That's why something like Mario had to be a little bit slower paced and not quite Sonic-like. You really couldn't have achieved Sonic on the Super Nintendo, I'm sad to say.
Yeah.
So with Thunder Spirits, which was really just Thunder Force 3, a lot of the graphics had to be changed. They look a little bit weird, and it really just runs very poorly, which was a common thing for early Super Nintendo shoot-'em-ups like Gradius 3 and Super R-Type. So it's not a good port. So if you have to play Thunder Force 3, I would not say that you should start out with Thunder Spirits. But it's there.
And the other thing about, sorry to interrupt, Ozzy, the other thing about Thunder Spirits too, I actually have it. It's a nice thing to have, if you're a fan of the series, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't have auto fire, which... When I first got it, I was like, "What? I have to buy like a turbo controller?" Oh, dude! And then after I bought the turbo controller, which no regrets, but like after I got the turbo controller, I found out that you actually can turn on auto fire. It's accessible through a hidden menu in the game.
Sweet.
Why would you put it in a hidden menu? I mean, what?
I know. Why would you do that?
My favorite part of that story, Paul, was that you were so outraged about having to buy a turbo controller, and the next sentence out of your mouth was like, "So then I bought the turbo controller," and
yeah, but no, it's a Thunder Force 3. Really, as Paul has mentioned, if you're gonna play a Thunder Force game, you can't do worse than Thunder Force 3.
3 is where 3 is definitely where you want to start.
Yeah, I haven't started with that one, and I'm sorry to say that I still have yet to play it because I think right now it's in that uncomfortable place that there really isn't any easy way to play it unless you either play it through an emulator or you buy the original cart.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but I don't think that the card is that expensive. But who the hell knows? Maybe I'm just going through.
We'll check that on our next
Maybe
break.
I'm just going through like repercussions of the aneurysm I had a few minutes back. So who knows? But I think it's one that you should definitely give it a go. Moving on, one of the interesting tidbits of the development of the era is that different teams actually handled ports for different consoles. And these ports could actually be almost like entirely different games. So one of the ports that Technosoft handled in the time was actually the TurboGrafx game Devil's Crush. And this one was actually a pinball game with a kind of demonic hellscape kind of setting, which it's just weird to everyone that this is a pinball game. But I haven't played this port, but typical to Technosoft, it has its own original soundtrack, and it's amazing. It's also amazing. So I don't know, have you played this port, Paul?
Oh yeah. I played the original and the port. The original I actually played. The beauty of pinball games is that they're quick. Mm-hmm. So like back in my early 20s, I was studying for a certification for a job. And, you know, it was like all day kind of studying, cramming, right? So I'd study, you know, for an hour, and then I'd take a break and I'd play Devil's Crush. And it was perfect, right? It like completely took my mind off the studying. It was quick, and it's actually like probably the best pinball game I've ever played even now. Like, it's really, really good. And the Mega Drive conversion, or the Genesis conversion, if you want to call it that too, because it was released here as Dragon's Fury.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, Dragon's Fury is Devil's Crush.
Really?
Oh, I didn't know,
It
dude.
was released here by Tengen, or Tengen, however you want to pronounce it. And that's the one that I actually have, because Devil's Crush for the TurboGrafx costs like a lot of money.
Yeah.
So if you want to play the game, and arguably a better version, Dragon's Fury for the Genesis, it's pretty cheap and fantastic game.
Yeah. No, it's one of those series that has eluded me. I know that there are a few entries in the series, like Alien Crush, etc. But I've always found it fascinating that they have this dark theme with great music, and it's just a pinball game.
Pinball machine. Yeah,
Well,
Yeah, I know.
Here's the thing. I wanted to ask about this because when I was looking it up to watch some gameplay footage of it, I always saw it as Devil Crash.
Yeah, there's another
yeah.
name. There's another
Yeah.
name. Devil Crash.
And so now that I know it's actually Dragon's Fury here, I'm like, oh my god, they couldn't license the word devil or something. Like,
Well, they took out all the demonic imagery. Like, actually, no, I shouldn't say that. They kept all like the monsters
Yeah.
and all the kind of shit that would give you nightmares, but they took out like pentagrams.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean? Because that stuff matters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was like I actually have Alien Crush on the TurboGrafx, and I really enjoyed that. I'm not a huge like virtual pinball guy. I'm not a huge pinball guy in general, but like watching gameplay of this is like I don't know. It was like an out of body experience. I was like, this cannot possibly exist. Like, I remember, I think the best way I can sum it up is a YouTube comment I saw on one of the videos was like, this is the most metal thing I've ever seen, and it's a pinball game. And I was like,
Yeah.
that
Sounds about right.
Yeah, I was like, that's perfect. Because
Yeah,
it's like, if you just saw a screenshot of it, you would never think it's a pinball game. Like, the imagery and like the sprite work and all the crazy stuff that's in it is so cool.
Yeah, I imagine that this came up during a very long night session of listening to Slayer, and they were just like, hey guys,
Yeah.
what about if we put Slayer in a pinball game? Maybe they were playing pinball while listening to Slayer, and that's how it came about. Who knows?
Yeah. But once again, like another, like Paul was saying, like another Genesis-ass Genesis game. Like, and I know this was on the TurboGrafx, but
Yeah, I would consider this more of a turbo game, but
Yeah.
it's not a game that you could envision coming out on the Super Nintendo.
yeah,
if
exactly.
what you're
That's
getting at.
more what I'm hinting at.
Yeah. All right, so moving on, we have the big one, which is Thunder Force 4, aka Lightning Force, Quest for the Dark Star. Silly name. But in any event, we've already talked a lot about this game, so I don't want to rehash a lot of what we discussed. We have another episode in which we talked about this quite at length, but
Yeah.
it's the definitive Technosoft game. And interestingly enough, it was actually developed by the same team that ported Aliens Crush. Oh, Devil's Crush, actually. So they were kind of just given a pick. What do you want to do next? And they were like, okay, we just want to do the next Thunder Force. So Thunder Force 2 and 3 was developed by the same team. And then Thunder Force 4 was just developed by a whole group of new people. And they wanted to prove themselves. They were like, we want to make sure that we not only live up to the expectations, but that we actually do better. And I would say they succeeded. I think that they did pretty good.
Yeah.
This game is amazing. There's just no other way to put it. There's just so much stuff going on at the same time on this game. And, most of the time the hardware feels it. You have a lot of slowdown at times, but it just looks so damn cool every single time. And it's just the complement of the music, the ships, the enemies, all of it just kind of coalesces into a very sublime experience of just being enthralled by everything that's happening around you. So,
Yeah.
Anthony, I know that you just played this recently. Did you play it originally, or was it?
No. I first played it yesterday.
Yeah. What were your thoughts on it?
Oh, I was just like, it just took me right back to the first time I played Thunder Force 3. Yeah, you could, I mean, it's Thunder Force 3, and they just, somehow they made it even better like the whole scrolling levels, like the whole.
Yeah, you can go up or down. It's quite a large level.
I'm playing it for 15 minutes before I realize I can actually go all the way down on the level. So it's like a whole screen. I mean, like, who would have thought about that?
Yeah, because you're told in most shoot 'em ups that you can't really touch the edges of the level.
Yeah.
And so you don't really think that you can have that capability.
This one you can scroll down all the way down, and you got all different types of enemies on the bottom of the screen. You go up, and then you gotta wait. You gotta worry that those enemies from the bottom of the screen that you don't see as you're on the top of the screen are coming up to get you. Yeah. I was like, oh man, so this was gonna take me a little bit. It's gonna take me a minute to like kind of get used to get to the timing down and everything, but. It's great that they have this on Sega Ages for the Switch.
Yeah. Like, it's quite cheap also. It's just if you want it,
it's right there.
You really don't have to go out of your way. It's really easy to kind of pick up and play.
And just another amazing Sega Ages release. Like I wouldn't have thought they were going to release this game.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, I know.
And when you're playing it, even now on the Switch, when you're playing it now, it's amazing that this was a 16-bit game.
It looks very modern.
To think that it's a 16, this was done with 16-bit graphics.
Yeah,
like amazing.
Paul,
and the other thing worth noting too, to this day, Thunder Force 4 has the best ship explosion sound. Like, when you die, you fucking die, man. You know it. It's like this bassy, like really bassy explosion. Boo! And it's like, oh my god, I fucking died.
Yeah, and it kind of lingers for a little bit so that you can watch the explosion and lament the fact that you died. I always find it interesting that it gives you like a quick second to regret your choices. So,
also though, if anyone's listening to this and they're gonna look this game up on the Switch store, just make sure you look it up as Lightning Force.
Yes, because it's actually not there as Thunder Force.
Lightning Force.
Yes. But Paul, I don't think I've heard you talk about this, but how did you get a hold of this game the first time?
Well, I was what, like 18 or 19 or something like that. So Genesis games were, all but phased out, and it was really easy to find them at used game stores for super cheap. So a lot of the Genesis games that I have now, like Gyres, like Lightning Force, Thunder Force 3, and so on and so forth, Gunstar Heroes, like those were all games that I bought when I was in my late teens and could afford them a lot more easily than I'd be able to now. So that was basically all it was. Like I had this Nomad. I wanted some games that I either had played or wanted to play, and that was that. I just saw it at the store, and I'm like, oh, it's a shoot 'em up. Cool, I'll get it.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly, I played it on the Sega Ages first, and I don't regret it. I could talk forever about how great Sega Ages is, but it's a great way to experience the game. And if you are intimidated by the difficulty of these games, there's actually what they call a kids mode. I haven't tried it because I am ashamed to
I put it on kid mode right away. I played it 2 times and I was like, oh wait, I'm 41. Yeah, I'm putting this on kid mode.
Yep. So even if you're not a kid, but your instincts have dulled down a little bit, I think that really it's something that is very accessible nowadays. So yeah, Arnie, any thoughts on Thunder Force 4? Have you actually gotten to play it yet?
I have not played it yet, which is my great shame.
Why are you here, Arnie?
To tell you that this is...
You're fired. Okay, you're hired because you're the only one that's on the podcast all the time.
Exactly. I'm here to tell you that this is my favorite translated title for any video game ever, first of all. But
it's really strong.
It's the best. But also that but I mean, there's like for this one specifically, even if I had played it, what am I going to say? That it's awesome and you should play it? Like
you should.
All of you have? Yeah, it's great. Like go play it. Go play it now. Go buy it on the Switch and play it.
Thank you for your input, Arnie.
I mean,
wow, easy, Arnie.
Here's the thing about Thunder Force 4 is that like everybody seems to agree. Everybody seems to agree that this is like the pinnacle of not just Thunder Force the series, but of Technosoft's like video game release catalog in general. Like it's a masterpiece.
Yeah, if you had to play one Technosoft game, this is it.
Yeah.
If you only had one Technosoft game to pick, this will be it.
Yeah.
So,
I guess
yeah.
I want to ask Paul real quick. 3 and 4, like, which one do you pick? Like, is this hands down the better game?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's 4. Like, don't get me wrong. Like I said, if you want like a nice introduction, 3's a great game.
Yeah.
4 is a fucking masterpiece as far as I'm concerned.
It's like comparing A New Hope to Empire Strikes Back. They're
That's
both
fair.
great,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like Empire Strikes Back just has that hot scene, and you're like, God, this is so great. You know, it's just one serves as the introduction and setting up the world, and the other one is just like taking it up to 11. So definitely go out and play it. It's on the Switch. If you don't have a Switch like Arnie, I don't know, man.
Just don't play it. Just look at it on YouTube or something.
Anyways, let's take one more quick break so we can wrap this up, and we'll be back in a moment.
Yep.
Alright guys, and we're back, and this is where history for Technosoft just starts kind of getting a little bit muddy. Certainly, if Thunder Force 4 was the peak, then it was just kind of downhill from there. It really was the moment where Technosoft just kind of started losing its way. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that this was the same time that developers were transitioning to 3D. I know we like to say a lot that the transition to the high definition era really hurt Japan, and that's very correct. But we can't really forget all the developers that just kind of disappeared when there was a transition from 2D to 3D. And I definitely think that Technosoft was one of those casualties, unfortunately. Yeah. But before their demise, they did manage to knock out some very good games, though. And one of them was Hyperduel. And, there are a lot of shoot-em-ups that are very obscure because shoot-em-ups nowadays are just an obscure genre. But Hyperduel, even within the genre, it's obscure. And it's because it was actually originally released in the arcades in 1993, and only later, 3 years later, ported to the Saturn in 1996. And it kind of looks a lot like Thunder Force, but it looks darker and in a way more gritty. Thunder Force always had, even though it was, kind of violent and intense, it still kind of felt cartoony in some ways. It felt very much like an animated game. But with Hyperduel, it pretty much feels much more metallic, and it feels much more darker. So it actually, one of the things that surprised me about it is that it has simultaneous 2-player. And you can actually, similar to Herzog's Y, you can transform from a ship to a mech. And actually, the way that it works is if you shoot with one button, then the ship automatically transforms into a mech. And if you shoot with the other button, it transforms into a ship. So you don't actually have to do like a transformation. There's not like a transformation button.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of cool. Unfortunately, the game is extremely rare. Like, I'm talking about excess of $500 rare for Saturn. I went on eBay and I was just like, oh, let me see, because generally Saturn games in Japan are not that expensive. Here in the US, a lot of Saturn games are expensive just because it didn't sell that well. And we just kind of take it for granted. But there are a lot of Saturn games in Japan, because it was more popular, that are very cheap. When I looked at Hyperduel, I was just taken aback because I could see some of them like in the $900 range. And here I am complaining about Panzer Dragoon Saga. And we're talking about Radiant Silvergun being $200. And here comes Hyperduel, and it's like, just, give me $550 and we'll call it a day.
Yep.
Which, with a shmup, which is a genre which you could get through the game maybe like in 30, 35 minutes, it's kind of hard to justify plopping down that amount of money. So, unfortunately, this is one of those titles that is kind of relegated to history for the most part. So,
Yes,
did any of you guys look at this game online?
I did.
What do you think?
And I have to say, I know Thunder Force 4 is a masterpiece, but of all the games that I saw, this is the one that I most wanted to play immediately. It
looks really cool.
So good. And the thing is, even I remember because Paul has in like if there's one thing I've learned from Paul is that the opening song to Lightning Force is one of the greatest opening songs of all time. But the opening song to Hyper Duel, I really liked. Like, it kicks ass. Like, this game is really cool, fast moving. Like, and one of the things that I took away from what you were saying, Ozzy, that I think is true is the transition from 2D to 3D really hurt a lot of developers. And there's just like this lost generation of really good 2D games on 3D consoles that just did not sell well and are incredibly hard to find and super expensive. And I want to play all of them, and I can't play any of them.
There are so many casualties, and I think that, you know, that's in Japan, but here in the West, there were just like almost, it was seen as backwards. No one wanted to touch 2D sprite games, and it's sad to see that perhaps a lot of developers actually just left the industry altogether because, you know, they had a particular set of skills, and that set of skills will not become relevant again until like 2 decades later.
Yep. Which is the thing now, because like 2D is coming back around like in a big way, and now people are starting to rediscover all these amazing games that you just can't find. Like,
and but I do find it incredibly sad that a lot of these developers, they were so influential, and they're probably just living out their lives, not really knowing that their games really shape generations to come.
Yeah.
I really find that sad, and it almost makes me want to just find them and be like, hey man, here, have a plaque. You know, sorry, it's the same one we gave Anthony.
Wait,
so.
I'm getting the plaque first, man. Like, hold on.
Do you see any of this gameplay, Paul, or?
I had no idea it existed until, you know, maybe like a year ago or something like that. And I mean, it looks good, but there's no fucking way I'm playing it on the Saturn at that price.
And the unfortunate part about the Saturn, guys, is that there isn't even proper emulation. So it's the reason why I even haven't gotten to play Panzer Dragoon Saga. I'm looking at you, Anthony, who has it and could, lend it to me. Well, but no, it's really hard. And I think every time I buy a Sega Ages game, they always have a survey. And at the end of the survey, they say, if you could only have one game, and seriously, we mean it, only one game, which one would it be? And I just put Panzer Dragoon Saga. And I hope that I've bought enough of the Sega Ages games that they're finally going to eventually listen to me. Because honestly, guys, the Saturn really deserves a lot more love. And I'm looking here at the Genesis Mini, and it looks fantastic. I'm probably going to get it. But what we really need is for the Saturn games to really kind of make a comeback. Yeah. And really, have more exposure to players that never had a chance to play it because they were too amazed with Final Fantasy VII's graphics to be able to, care about this, shoot 'em up that came out in 1993 on arcades.
I mean, I think now would be the best time to do a Saturn, Sega Ages or whatnot, and just release the 2D games.
Yeah,
just release all the 2D games that were on the Saturn.
Well, I'm thinking some of them like, Radiant Silvergun, or what's the other treasure
Silhouette
one?
Mirage.
Yeah, Silhouette Mirage, etc.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of good games that could be introduced to a whole new generation that didn't get a chance to play it. But in any case, moving on from that, Hyper Duel, really cool looking game. Unfortunately, I don't think any of us are going to play it in our lifetimes.
Nope.
But moving on, 1994, they came out with Neketsu Oyako, which is translated as Hot-Blooded Family. And you know what, guys? It's dramatic reading time. So I'm just going to read the concept, description, taking off Moby Games. So let's just put some mood music and let's give it a go. Middle-aged housewife Saeko Hibino has a secret. She's actually a Nobel laureate theoretical physicist who devised a completely new type of antimatter fusion reactor at only 17 years old. But when a band of no-good bad guys calling themselves the Haragudo Dan find out, they figure she's perfect to help them complete their ultimate secret doomsday weapon and kidnap her. Her family are gonna take this lying down though, and immediately take up arms, setting out to free her by whatever means necessary. There are 3 characters to choose from: Saeko's husband, former pro wrestler, Rando, their fighting prodigy daughter, Ryo, and Saeko's freeloading research assistant, Torataro Minowa. So, there you go.
This is
Like, freeloading research assistants?
that was my favorite because I
This
was
game
like,
is so realistic on so many levels.
They probably don't pay him, so that's why he has to, like, freeload.
well, here's the thing. It's like, who are the 3 people who would most care about this person? Her husband, her daughter, and her research assistant. Obviously.
It's like, he can't freeload if she's not there.
Yeah,
Oh,
like,
true.
Freeloading research assistant. All right.
And you know what? This is Japan Strikes Again. The freeloading research assistant. He's black.
Oh, man.
Of course.
God
Of
damn it,
course they
Japan!
did.
You are so terrible.
Seriously, man.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's.
I like how there's a doomsday device, but like they don't call the cops.
No.
They just
Did you not hear the part where her husband is a pro wrestler? Like, obviously he can handle this.
Of course.
Was
of course.
everyone
My-
back
my
in the day in
mistake.
Japan a pro wrestler? Because Mike Hagar in Final Fight, not only was he the major, but he was a wrestler as well.
Okay, so here's the thing. When I saw gameplay footage of this, I think it was somewhere, I don't remember where I saw it, but somewhere I saw that this was heavily inspired by Final Fight. And when they say heavily inspired, what they mean is that the husband character is Mike Hagar with a shirt on.
Exactly.
Like, it's the
exactly.
same
They were just
sprite.
not like, they were like, okay, we're gonna be inspired, quote unquote. Yeah, no.
But it looked,
So this is
looked really fun. Like, it looked
Yeah, this
ridiculous.
is a beat 'em up. It's a typical beat 'em up. Actually, funnily enough, Adai said that actually, no, it wasn't Adai. It was another one of the developers that I read the interview. They said that it started out as a platformer where you would play with mechs, etc. But it then ended up being just a beat 'em up, a build scrolling beat 'em up. So yeah, Final Fight. Basically, if you have seen Final Fight, with a wackier premise, that's really what Nekatsu Oyako is. So funnily enough, you can actually get this game on the Japanese PSN store. It's only like $6,
wow.
which comes out to like 599 yen. So it's actually there for the taking if you want it. You can play it. I haven't gotten it yet, but it certainly looks interesting.
I wouldn't pay more than $6 for it.
No, absolutely not. It doesn't look like a great game. It looks very derivative, unfortunately. But moving on, Blastwind. This was another shoot 'em up, except it was vertical. And this is another one that's very interesting because it had a very tortured development history. From what I have read, the rumor is that Blastwind was actually a game that was developed alongside Hyperduel. And it was actually meant to be released for arcades. But for whatever reason, and I happen to think it was probably because of the transition to 3D and the waning popularity of shoot 'em ups, it just was never released. And I think at this time, Technosoft was having a lot of financial difficulties. Like, you hear them speak and they were like not getting their bonus or whatever. I mean, the funny thing about Japan is that if you don't get your bonus, that's basically like your living wage. So if you don't get a bonus, then you're basically getting paid less than minimum wage. And I think they were really struggling. The big RPG series that they were launching, which was kind of a point and click RPG game, did not really do well. And they kind of bet the farm on it. So as a stopgap, I think they had this old concept for this other game, and they just decided, well, we're just gonna repackage this and release it for the Saturn 4 years later. And so that's what it eventually came out to. And it's a very, very short game by all accounts. Like, it takes you like 20 minutes in order to get through the whole thing. Oh. And it's kind of interesting. There's not much to it. You kind of hit the switches and it can alter the route that you take.
Yeah, I saw that.
So in that sense, it's a little bit cool, but it's, I think, nothing more than a curiosity nowadays. It has a very wacky story. It's actually like a biblical story where there's like Noah and an ark, and there's like nuclear fallout, and the people that survive in this ark, eventually go out, and there's an Adam and Eve and stuff like that. And the only way to know this is through the book, because otherwise you wouldn't know. but it's an interesting title. But like Hyperduel, it's also extremely expensive, and it's like $250 to $300. Not quite Hyperduel expensive,
That's a steal.
but still, for 20 minutes of gameplay, I don't think that it's worth it.
No way.
So,
and here's the other thing. I don't know what you thought about it, Ozzy, but when I was watching gameplay of this, it's funny because there is like, in my mind, there's a tier of like shoot 'em ups. Like there's like Thunder Force 4 and Hyperduel are like top tier, and this is sort of like middle of the road in the sense that like if you showed me this game, I wouldn't be able to pick it out. Like if you showed me like 4 different shooters and this was one of them, I probably wouldn't be able to pick it out from like any other generic shmup. Honestly.
yeah, there's really no defining factor in this game, honestly. I don't see anything in it that I would say, yeah, that's a Technosoft game. Of course, the music is actually pretty great as well. So there's always that. You can always count on Technosoft to give you some really good music.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think that this is kind of a hallmark of Technosoft at all.
Also, this was like, there was just like a moment in time, I think, not a moment, but like between the 80s and 90s where like, you just took 2 random words together and like made a shmup. Right? Like
No, Blastwind actually refers to nuclear. It's a nuclear term, actually. Blastwind actually it's the wind from the pressure of the nuclear bomb. So
Arnie, I was thinking the same thing as you. I was like, wow,
well,
they
was
get
like,
lazy with their naming.
Thunder Force, Blastwind, Hyperduel, like
I was like, was somebody flagellant when they named this game? No. But now, Ozzy made it so real now. So
yeah.
Thanks, Ozzy.
Yeah, I kind of played the downer here. No, anyone else want to mention anything about Blastwind? I don't really have a lot to say about this one, actually.
No, just maybe.
Nah, it doesn't look very good. You know, it's 20 minutes. You're playing it to get a high score, not really to beat it. I don't know. Doesn't look that great to me.
Here's
anyhow.
the thing that I noticed when going through like the Technosoft like the footage I was watching is that a good chunk of their catalog these games are extremely short. Like a lot of these long plays are like 30 minutes to maybe like an hour.
Yeah, but that's if you're really good.
Yeah, of course.
Honestly.
If you're like amazing and never die, which is not me, but I'm just saying like it's crazy to think how good some of these games are and how like if you're good enough, how little gameplay you actually get out of them.
Yeah, a fun fact about this, Technosoft was actually in talks to release a compilation of Hyperduel, Blastwind, and Thunder Force AC.
And of course,
and Working Designs was to release it in the US. Working Designs actually released Thunder Force 5, which we'll talk about next. So in an alternate timeline, we could have been able to experience these games in a compilation. And if you put all these 3 games in a compilation, that would have been a really good compilation. I would have really been down for that.
It would have also been in like an amazing package, and it probably cost like $350.
Especially Working Designs in particular for Saturn. I mean, what the hell? That would have been, we would have been talking about Magic Knight Ray Earth amount of money. Which let's kind of close out with Thunder Force 5 because there are a few other games, but honestly, at this point, Technosoft was just they were kind of filling out themselves in the dark. You could see like a lot of their 3D games that they tried, they did not look good at all. Some of them were like kind of like arena fighters in the vein of Virtual-On, but not good. And unfortunately, I don't think that they were really able to grapple with the 3D movement. But they did release their big last game, which was Thunder Force 5, which came out in Japan and in the US. And, we talked about this game in one of the previous episodes, but unfortunately, it's just a lot more inferior than Thunder Force 4 and even Thunder Force 3. I have a different opinion from Paul with respect to this. I think that it's not a game that has aged well at all, and so because of that, it's not very good anymore. Paul, I think you think that it's still good. I played it again, and the problem with it, and I think I mentioned it to you, Paul, is that it's a mix of polygonal and sprite-based graphics, and it looks dark, and the mix of pixelated graphics and polygonal graphics, etc., just makes it very hard to tell what's going on. And so you have bullets and enemies flying at you from left and right, and you don't really know, who is closest to you. And also there are a lot of enemies moving from the the background, the foreground. And back in Thunder Force 4, you could always tell because, they looked smaller and you kind of could tell them apart when they were in the background. In Thunder Force 5, it's very hard to do that so that you don't know if you can actually go over an enemy because it's in the background rather than the foreground. So I had a very hard time with it. One of the things with it, and Paul, you mentioned it, is that it has this all-range weapon that essentially is the World Destroyer. So it's kind of like playing it on easy mode. So even if you suck at Thunder Force, you play with this weapon and, you'll probably get by.
To me, that's actually the big failing of it. The graphics, like I don't disagree with any of those points. They just bother me less than they bother you. And I like the Thunder Force gameplay, in that regard. It feels like a Thunder Force game, but the freeway laser is such a killer. It's so, I don't know who balanced the game, but man, that weapon is ridiculous. I guess they were hoping that because it's difficult to aim, that, it would kind of make up for the fact that it's super powered. But, when you're fighting against bosses, most of the bosses are on the right side of the screen. So just aim the laser to the right and keep it there. And then you kill the boss in 2 seconds sometimes. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, have you played it, Arnie?
I vaguely remember playing this years ago, though, so I don't remember much about it. It didn't stick out in my mind back then, but I was also an idiot, so maybe if I played it now, I'd appreciate it a little more.
Yeah, but the other big thing is that when you look at Technosoft in the Genesis era, they were kind of at the top of the pile.
Yeah.
But when you look at them in the PS1 era, there were so many other developers that were doing great things.
Yeah.
Like Raystorm and the G Darius, and there were so many good shmups on the PS1 as well that that this one just kind of falls by the wayside. It's very middle of the road compared to everything else that came out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because it's kind of the last gasp of Technosoft and kind of their last big game. And I will give you this. It still has some very excellent music. It's still, top of the line in terms of music for Technosoft.
Yeah.
Anthony, did you play Thunder Force 5?
No, I didn't play Thunder Force 5. It was it was one of those games I just missed.
Yeah.
PS1 era, Saturn era. But I remember looking at the game. It was one of those games I had on my list to get because I just wanted to get all the Thunder Force games.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I'm with Paul. The style of it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
I was kind of intrigued by the style of it, but like I said, I didn't really play the game, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's out there. This is another one that you can get
$20?
if you have if you have a Japanese account, you can get it as a PS Classic. So I certainly, I mean, this one is $80 if you buy it physical. So
yeah.
It's not one that I would like it for collection purposes, but it's not one that I would actually go out of my way to get. Yeah. Particularly if you can get it for cheaper online.
Yeah.
But it's there, it exists, and one fun fact to close out, Thunder Force 5, their bosses are all named after rock bands. So there's a boss called Deep Purple, and I forget the other names, but certainly it's it's something to laugh about.
That's pretty cool.
And then Thunder Force 6 was developed by Sega, right?
Yeah, it was developed by Sega, so we're not gonna get into that one. We already talked about that one in a prior episode, but it's a good one. It's actually good. Paul, I think his consensus is not as good as Thunder Force 5, but still pretty good.
No, I'd say it's probably better than 5. And
Thunder Force 4. I mean, not better than Thunder Force 4 is what I meant.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah.
But no, still good, fun game. Not too difficult. Yep.
Yeah. So I guess we're just going to close it out. I mean, Arnie, let me start with you since you haven't played any of these games. What do you think is the legacy of Technosoft? And do you see a future for their IPs?
I mean, I think we're seeing that there's a future for their IPs. Sega has put out Lightning Force. I think they'll eventually put out at least more Thunder Force games for sure. But I think, Technosoft is one of those developers that really infuriates me because I didn't get to experience them when they were around, and now most of their stuff is so expensive that I probably won't get to play a lot of it. But I mean, just from looking at the games, you can tell Like, these people knew what they were doing, they knew what they were good at, and they sort of perfected that and made it their thing. You know, even as late as the Saturn era with stuff like Hyperduel, they were doing great things. And I think that's going to be their legacy in the long term, is they're going to be sort of the pioneers of a lot of the stuff that people nowadays are really starting to come back and really enjoy. Shoot 'em ups, 2D sort of sprite work like that. And, you know, even with their early stuff, you know, sort of pioneering polygonal graphics for computers and, you know, doing work in that field. And obviously once Herzog Zwei comes out on Switch, it's going to be like the #1 game in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, just kind of carrying off of that. What do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, so it's kind of bittersweet because
how is it sweet?
Because they're dead now.
All these employees
they're not
lost
here
their
anymore.
It's sweet because they won't be able to make any more $500 games that I won't be able to buy.
Well, the thing with Technosoft though is that, like, it's kind of almost ironic that they were the first to try to mess around with polygons in games, yet when the industry went that route, they were just not able to keep up.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you know, a company is not an entity. It's a bunch of people, and when those people leave, you know, someone like Yoshimura, you know, she was a star and she was a prodigy, and you know, they just, you know, employees come and go, and you know, sometimes you don't get the best talent when you make that transition, and I think that was proven in the transition to the HD era. But
I'm like optimistic, just what Sega's doing, acquiring the IPs and everything, that we're gonna start seeing a lot of these games more. It's just a matter of we're seeing the Genesis stuff, which is great. Mm-hmm. So now it's just a matter of, like, can we possibly see the Saturn stuff?
Yeah, perhaps.
Let's see.
What are your thoughts, Paul?
Well, it's a really interesting story for them, and it kind of shows what happens when, at least in that era, when you just kind of specialize in the wrong genre.
Yeah.
And the shoot 'em up genre was definitely not where you want it to be in the mid 90s, and they suffered for that, where a company like Falcom, for example, you know, specializing in RPGs and adventure games, more easily able to make the transition to 3D. I mean, they had their own growing pains, but at least they were able to survive because they were focused on a genre that would forever remain popular. But Technosoft, not so much, right?
Yep.
You can push the envelope on a sprite-based system with that genre, but once you hit 3D, you know, the whole thing falls apart, and suddenly what you're good at doesn't really mean anything anymore. But going forward, now that, you know, the shoot 'em up is back and people are really interested in them now, like, they're such a pure action game, right? It's like it's the most pure form of video game action, and I can see why they're making a comeback now. So yeah, there's definitely a future for the IP. Obviously, they've released, you know, TF4 on the Switch. Maybe they even work on a new one, who knows? But until then, I'm happy with the re-releases. I'm happy with games like Devil Engine on the Switch, which is basically a new Thunder Force. And yeah, I think we're good.
I one thing I did want to say, because Paul reminded me of, is, like, you're right. Like, when you specialize in the wrong genre, like, that can be very hurtful, especially if that's, like, your one thing. Yeah. But I think the problem was more so, I don't even think it was a talent issue. I think shooters are very reliant on spectacle, in my opinion. Like, a shooter needs to play well, obviously, but it also needs to look good, and it needs to look cool, because I feel like, unlike RPGs, graphics matter a bit more for shooters. And so when you transition to a new sort of form factor in 3D, like, I know I've said this before, but early polygon games look like hot garbage. Like, they do, and I feel like when you are reluctant to transition to that because you feel like your games are not going to have that same look that they're known for, and they're not going to have maybe that same impact on players because of that, you know, you sort of paint yourself in a corner, right? Eventually, when you go to polygons, it's just not going to look as good. And I think that was a big thing as well.
Yeah. Just to close it out, I mean, I think that, the fact that Sega thought enough of them to buy their IP so that they wouldn't lapse and someone else would just kind of take it over and never use them, kind of like what's happened with Konami and Hudson's games. I think that speaks a lot about, what the industry thinks of them, which is that they did some very good things and that these are things that should be preserved for future generations. And in the best cases, their games are still very playable and very enjoyable nowadays. I mean, I know that I went through Thunder Force 4 and I've kept playing it and playing it and playing it until I got better. Even though there are so many more technologically advanced games nowadays. So I do hope that in the future, Sega does a little bit more with them than just, kind of reissue the older games. I do hope that some sort of Herzog's Y sequel would eventually take place.
What's the number? What's 3?
I don't know.
Herzog try.
We don't have Strilla here, so we're kind of stuck. And so I think that in terms of Thunder Force, it would be nice if Sega did something similar to what they're doing with Streets of Rage, which is that, some indie company kind of really passionate about the series just takes it over and brings it to a new generation and does something entirely different with it. And I think in that vein, it was good that Thunder Force 6 was in 3D and Thunder Force 5 was also in 3D. But it'd be nice to go back to the 2D style, with really nice, chunky graphics. As Paul said in the Devil Engine mode, hell, get the Devil Engine people and make, give them Thunder Force, to make a game for. So I would be really excited for that. And, and beyond that, it would be really exciting if Sega was able to release some of their more obscure titles. So that's always a nice thing to look forward to. And certainly with Technosoft, it feels like I am a little bit more optimistic than many other, developers that kind of went extinct.
Right.
And whose, licenses we don't know where we lie. Like, let's say Quintet. We don't really know if we're ever going to see Terranigma, again. But with this, we know that Sega has been taking very good care of their licenses, and I think that they're going to do it a good service. So, and with that, we're going to close out. But before we close out, we don't usually do this, but I feel like with this one, I really need to say it, and just talk about some of the sources, because we really can only bring you this and talk about this interesting facts, standing on the shoulders of people that have done this before and have gone through the trouble. So one of the big, materials that for research purposes helped me a lot was a translation of interviews with some of the developers that Schmopulations did. If you don't know Schmopulations, they're a fantastic, website. It's basically one guy and he just kind of goes every month and finds old Japanese interviews and just translates them little by little. And a lot of the things that I have learned about games that no one knew about has come from Schmopulations. For example, I just learned, and I think the world just learned, about the fate of Akitoshi, the guy that did Castlevania, which we made a big deal about, that he just kind of disappeared, and now we know what happened to him. So, definitely go give him a visit. Moby Games, I go there, it's kind of like the IMDb of games. They just have a lot of important information.
Yep.
Hardcore Gaming 101, Corcolata does a lot of good things with that website, and they kind of just really dig into very obscure games. So I was able to get a lot, on Hyper Duel and Blastwind. And lastly, and I think the biggest point of research for me, was The Untold History of Japanese Game Development, Volume 3, by John Stepaniak. I probably just completely butchered his last name, but, he did very good work in going to Japan and finding all these developers that were not, in many cases, even involved in gaming anymore. And, there was a big interview with Arai. And that's how I got to learn a lot of the history of Technosoft. So definitely, give it a look and buy the titles if you can. And with that, I'm just going to close out. So first of all, Anthony, where can we find you?
You can find me on Instagram, polybits_. I'm usually there all the time.
All the time. Yeah, that's where he lives. What about you, Paul?
Instagram, Paul's_game room.
And Artie?
Instagram at Region Free Gamers Podcast. I have a personal one, but I don't use it anymore, so just go find me there. And on Twitter at Region Free Gamer, YouTube, Region Free Gamers, anywhere you can think to type those words, you'll probably
He's
find
probably there.
me. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So that's kind of like our pitch for Region Free Gamers. You can find us in all those websites and all those links. For me, you can find me on Instagram at Shadow of the Collector. That's pretty much the only social media that I do nowadays. But yeah, you can find us on iTunes. Like I said, please leave us a review. I really know we say this and it's annoying to hear it and you just kind of tune it out. But seriously, like we, would really appreciate if you left us a review. So if you can do that, go on iTunes and make sure to let us know what you think. If you think we're hot garbage, we'd like to know that.
Be gentle.
But just be gentle.
Use nice words.
Our egos are delicate.
Maybe call us lukewarm garbage.
Delicate flowers here.
Yes, but this was a really fun episode. We definitely look forward to doing this episodes, and especially talking about things that no one asked for, but we just kind of brought it for you, for your listening pleasure. And if anything, I hope that we lulled you to sleep. Maybe you don't have to take Xanax anymore.
Those medications are expensive. You're welcome.
Yeah, and addictive. I mean, we're a lot cheaper. We're a cheap date. Anyways, we've gone on for far too long. So this is the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. And until next time, keep schmupping.